I'd say that the best way to describe it, Al, is that it's a sort of a career autobiography videotape.
You mean, how did I get into
what
I'm doing? How did I get into science?
Yes, you know that.
What in my childhood got me into science?
Yeah.
Or
well, you know, we have a tape of Segre, you know,
oh, yeah.
as an example, and he was very proud of his childhood experiences, you know, where he was born and so forth. And he had a notebook which he carried out certain experiments when he was 7 years old.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And there essentially was Newton's original, you know, experiments with the prisms and the water and so forth. And he, with his crayons, you know, he had sketched the colors and so forth. But the most amazing thing was his handwriting at the age of 7 was absolutely perfect, you know, just...
it's the same as his handwriting at the age of 70.
Yes, probably better. But anyhow, these vary, but in general, you know, a little bit of this. You see, we give everybody a tape, you know, for their own records and posterity and so forth, and a little bit of you know, the background and where you were born and so forth and so on, and at what age you became interested in science or mathematics, and then your college, your choices in college and so forth, and then of course leading into your graduate work. And then, of course, I guess almost immediately after your graduate work, you went into the Manhattan Project. It's always very interesting. The various people have told about their reactions when they first learned about, you know, fission and their reactions and so forth.
Yeah.
And Louis Alvarez tells about how he was reading it. He was reading it in the barbershop, you know, that famous story. And then leading into your work with Wigner and so forth, and designing the Hanford file, and just make it a very informal.
Will you ask questions?
And then I ask questions but primarily for clarification, you know, and perhaps sometimes I would like to have you expand on a certain subject, then I will. But I would comment as we go along.
Yeah, sure.
And the format is, what I do is I say a few words, and then I use the words, please proceed, and then you just start talking. And then before we put these into the archives, I have a formal introduction, which I prepare for each person, and then dub that in.
Oh, yeah.
So at the beginning. So that's the.
Well, about how long do you think the thing lasts? Usually about 45 minutes.
No, it as a minimum of an hour.
An hour.
And as we go along, you find out time does go by awfully fast, and so in your case. I'd be delighted if it would be closer to 2 hours than to 1 hour, but at least an hour and a half. But we'll just see how it works out.
The story of our life.
Yes. Well,
be told in was it 3 words or?
But as you can see, I've had fantastic experience, you know, with all these people, and you know, I thought, for instance, in the case, you know, of the difficulties in going to graduate school during the Depression, you know, and I thought I was the only one, you know, that really had to scrounge. You might say. Charlie Towns told the story of how he calculated that probably he'd be able to get along with 2 meals a day, you know, and that would enable him to get by comfortably. And that's what I did, you know.
Oh, really?
Yes. When I was going to graduate school, and so, but I didn't think anybody else ever did it. But Charlie Towns said, well, everybody was doing that.
Yeah,
so, So, but at any rate, these are interesting sidelights.
Yeah.
And right as we were about 2/3 of the way through, at Berkeley, the Carillons started, and Charlie Town's office is right out, practically outside the Carillons there. Well, at any rate, have you got the?
I've got a fix on him.
You got to fix that. Have you? Suppose you've already started. So that.
Are you running now?
Yes. We usually like to warm up the camera for about 10 minutes. And then also sometimes the first part of the tape is not as good as it is later.
How long does the tape run?
The tape runs for 2 hours.
Oh, really?
About 2 hours and 50 minutes.
Well, how much does a blank tape
Oh,
cost?
they're only about $10.
That's all.
Yeah.
I see.
So it's
with the soundtrack on it.
oh yes.
It's quite extraordinary.
It's a most extraordinary development.
I mean, and are there any American-made devices like that?
No, not. Actually, the technology was developed by RCA and licensed, but all the manufacturing is done.
Isn't that awful?
It is terrible.
Really terrible.
Yeah. And this tape, for instance, happens to be a Kodak tape. But, I think probably they manufactured it in Korea or
someplace like that.
Well, I think the camera's warmed up now, isn't it, Jane? So I think that, are you satisfied with the light, Jane?
I'm satisfied with the light. I'm a little nervous about the position of the chair. If I go back, I see a big dark thing on one side and not on the other.
Do you want me to
move
a bit?
Well, if the chair could go over just a little, maybe a foot.
Do that?
About a foot. Okay.
Wait a minute. No, right in the middle. That's a little too far.
How's that?
That's good.
Okay, do you want me to get rid of these directories?
I don't think they show, do they?
Well, they do.
Well, okay, let's just put it on the side.
Yeah, that's perfect. That is excellent. Yeah. Looks a lot better.
Yeah, all right.
And I can go back until I hit the mirror.
And the mirror doesn't show.
No, it doesn't. No, that's fine.
How's that?
Thank you. That's much better.
And you feel the lighting.
A little more balance.
You think that should I diffuse it?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think. I have a glass wool diffuser, but I think in this particular case it looks fine. Okay?
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, fine. Then I think we can start. See, what's the date today?
10.
Today is the
10th.
Today's I just make sure I want to get the date on the tape. Well, today, May 10th, 1984, we are privileged to interview Dr. Weinberg, who has had a distinguished career in the field of physics, mathematics, and nuclear science. And we are privileged to hear from him some of the highlights of his career. So with this brief introduction, I would like to present Dr. Weinberg, and so would you please proceed?
Well, let me say it's a real pleasure for me, Clarence and Jane, to have an opportunity to talk to you. I guess I will tell you things about myself that you probably don't know, although among the close friends that I have, I guess our lives have intersected as closely as any.
That's right, and for an extended period of time.
Yeah, people don't realize, perhaps, that you were my boss for, almost 15 years, I guess, at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and that actually you were a very close friend of my sister and brother-in-law, long before I knew that you existed.
Yes, that's right. I look back very fondly on those days.
Let me start with my early recollections of myself. I was born in Chicago. My parents were Russian Jewish immigrants who came to this country around 1908. And the atmosphere in our house was, as was the case with most of the Russian Jewish immigrants who came at that time, really quite intellectual. That they encouraged us, for example, my sister and I do have an older sister, about 5 years older than I, the atmosphere was one which placed a premium on intellectual excellence. We were required to take piano lessons, for example, and although I hated to play the piano at the time, I have kept with it all my 69 years. Now I enjoy it very much. I'm very grateful to my mother for having beaten on me to keep playing the piano. And of course, my sister had a very strong influence on me. She was, again, sort of person who was very bright, and she, of course, had to be at the head of her class always. And I was the kid brother, and I always had to emulate my sister. And people would say, well, when you grow up, you might do as well as your sister Faye did. And I think that my sister had a very strong influence on me in my very early days. My father was in the clothing manufacturing business. He was the manager of a factory that manufactured women's dresses. He was in that business.
And this was in Chicago.
It was in Chicago, yes. I went to school, grammar school in Chicago and also high school. And I guess I first had the idea that I might have a scientific career, I suppose, very early in life, although I didn't really know exactly, I can't really quite reconstruct exactly how I came to it. It may have been that when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I became a lone scout. The lone scouts were scouts who didn't belong to a real troop, but they were given a handbook, and then you were allowed to do things on yourself, on your own. And somehow I got involved with some of my friends at the time. We would do little experiments according to the book.
Oh yes, of course. In scouting, they have well-defined projects and experiments.
It wasn't all that well-defined quite at that time, as I recall, but I think that perhaps moved me somewhat in that direction. I suppose another thing was that very early, because my sister was older than I, our family bought the Book of Knowledge. And the Book of Knowledge was one of the standard encyclopedias of those days. You probably know about the Book of Knowledge. Yes,
yes, I know
loved
about
the Book of Knowledge. I just would read it and read it and read it. And I guess I learned an awful lot reading the Book of Knowledge. And then I remember my parents bought me a chemistry set for Christmas one time, and I loved to do experiments. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing, but it did sort of orient me towards science. And then I suppose a little bit later, I may have been in the 9th grade, possibly the 7th grade at the time, I somehow got hold of a book, Slosson's Creative Chemistry.
Oh yes, that's a very famous book.
That's right. And this was a book in which he talked about the advances in chemical technology, as we would call it, the chemical industry. And I was much intrigued by it, and somehow I thought that at that time I would become a chemical engineer, although I wasn't really very sure what a chemical engineer was.
Yes, and incidentally, in interviewing many people, particularly people like Teller and several others who have become physicists later, they started out in chemistry because they didn't see how they could make a living in physics at that time.
I moved into physics for a less lofty reason, which I will come to shortly, Clarence. Well, then I went to high school, and I was a very good student in high school. I also, again, following in the footsteps of my sister, became the editor of our newspaper. And I was the editor of our newspaper for a whole year. And I guess if I ask myself, what talents really do you bring to bear? I suppose to some degree it's a talent for articulating things, and I think that probably goes back to when I was the editor of our newspaper. As a matter of fact, I had been, again following my sister's footsteps, because she had been the editor of the newspaper, I had been the editor of our junior high school newspaper. And it was at that time, when I was in the 7th grade, I believe, the editor of our junior high school, that I had my first experience in causing the powers that be a great deal of trouble because of something that I had written.
Oh yeah.
And it was something like this, that we had an assembly. In those days, the students would get together, and the principal would get up, and there'd be an assembly. And the principal gave a stirring lecture on why the girls at the school should not use so much lipstick and rouge. And so I wrote an editorial, which I called "Watch the War Paint." When the dean of students saw that editorial in our junior high school newspaper, she was fit to be tied. The reason being that our newspaper circulated throughout the Chicago school system, and it ill became the dean of students at our junior high school to have it be known that at the Hibbard Junior High School, which is the name of the school I attended, that the girls were fallen women using all that war paint, and so all hell broke loose. But I guess by that time I was about ready to graduate, so they didn't have to demote me from being the editor of our newspaper. But that sort of has been, in a way, the story of my life, I guess.
Well,
I always say a little more than I should. People get very angry at me.
Well, that's remarkable. I'm reminded that one of the other people I interviewed was Dr. White, who is now head of the National Academy of Engineering.
Bob White.
And he spent a full year after he graduated from college as a newspaper reporter. Mm-hmm. And he said that was one of the most valuable experiences of his life, because he learned how to articulate things and write things so that people could understand. So that's this is interesting with regard to your experience in high school with the newspaper.
Well, in high school, I was a very good student. I think I graduated third in the class of there were about 700 students. And I took I didn't take biology, but I took all of the other sciences that were available then, and all of the mathematics. And I must confess that I didn't understand physics when I studied physics in high school, and I've often wondered why that was. And I guess I decided that it wasn't entirely my fault, although I guess it really indicated that I wasn't, and I have never regarded myself as really talented in science. That what I know in science and what few things I've accomplished in science, I've always felt have always come hard to me, that I've had to work harder than other people. But I do feel that to some degree I must mitigate my lack of success in science by the fact that at that time we didn't really have a person who understood physics teaching physics. I look back now, and the fellow who was teaching physics at the same time he was teaching high school physics was taking the elementary college course in physics at night.
Oh, yes.
And he was about one paragraph ahead of the class. And so I never could quite understand what the thing was quite about. Well, I passed the physics class all right with a good grade, but it wasn't nearly as good as I would get 98s and so on in chemistry. Chemistry I did great, and the fellow who taught chemistry was a good chemist. Well, he understood chemistry, not so in physics. I guess in later years have often contrasted that experience which I had in as very poor science instruction that was available in the Chicago high schools. Well, this was Roosevelt High School at the time, with remarkable science and mathematics instruction that some of my mentors, like Eugene Wigner, had in Hungary, in Budapest. Eugene Wigner has often said to me that he attended in Budapest the high school, which at the time probably was the best high school in the world.
Oh, yes.
The science and mathematics teachers there all were doing research in science and mathematics. And he often attributes his, well, of course, he's profoundly and tremendously talented innately, but he also often attributes his success in science to the marvelous underpinning that he received as a youngster in this Lutheran high school in Budapest.
Incidentally, I believe there were several other famous men attended high schools about at that.
Well, that same high school, there was Szilard, von Neumann, and Wigner, and they went to high school together at that Lutheran high school in Budapest, and they taught each other. But they also had these marvelous teachers, one mathematics teacher in particular who was able enough to recognize von Neumann as a great genius and helped him along. And I guess Teller came along a little bit later.
That's right. Well, that's a remarkable story. It's such a concentration of genius in one small area and in one brief period of time there.
Well, as I think about it, I guess I would say that I learned a good deal in high school. Didn't learn very much science, actually. Learned some chemistry, a little bit of physics, a fair amount of mathematics. I remember we went through trigonometry.
Oh, yes.
But at that time, we never heard of a derivative or the calculus.
Yes, well, that was standard so-called higher algebra and trigonometry. Right. That was as far as you would go in high school.
Right. Now, I actually skipped several grades through high school, so that when I graduated high school, I had just turned 16. And sometimes I think that was a big disadvantage as far as I was concerned, because then when I went on to the University of Chicago, I was really too young, so that I never felt comfortable socially at the University of Chicago all the time I was there.
Yes, well, being only 16, that meant you were perhaps at least 1 or 2 years
younger than
the others.
But I imagine so many of the people that you've interviewed had that experience, that they went through the elementary school and high school quicker than most, and so they came and had this disadvantage when they went to college, that they were, a little bit out of it socially.
That's right.
Well,
apparently wasn't too much of a disadvantage, except, as you say, socially, if you're
I never really felt terribly happy at college, I guess, probably for that reason. Well, then the Depression hit just when I graduated from high school. This was 1931, and I entered the University of Chicago. I did not get a scholarship my first year at the University of Chicago. They had entrance examinations. I took the entrance examination in physics, and I didn't understand physics very well, and so I don't think I didn't do well enough on the physics examination to get a scholarship. I did get scholarships after 1 year at the University of Chicago, else I wouldn't have been able to stay at the University of Chicago. My father by that time was out of a job, and it was pretty rough. We find places where you could get a nice meal for 10 cents.
Yes, well, that was universal.
Oh, yes.
You did manage
Yes.
manage to get along on these
Yes.
under these very stringent conditions.
Yeah. But then I came to the University of Chicago when the so-called new plan of Robert Hutchins was first instituted. And I must say that was the most powerful and best educational experience I think anybody could possibly have had.
How do you characterize that in a few words?
The general idea was that you were exposed to all branches of knowledge. And so you took a one-year course in the biological sciences. I enjoyed it tremendously. I had never had any biological sciences. You took a one-year course in the social sciences, a one-year course in the humanities, and a one-year course in the physical sciences. Because I had opted for a chemistry major, it wasn't necessary for me to take the physical sciences course, because I took other courses that covered it. But the other three, in biological, social, and humanities, I did take the courses, and they were just extraordinary. Very tough courses, had to work very hard at them, had to read everything, but I think that they gave me a better preparation than almost anybody else could have. Well, as good a preparation as anybody else at the University of Chicago. And our class was really quite an extraordinary class. I mean, some of my classmates were, well, some of them came later, some came about that same time. There was Paul Samuelson, who got the Nobel Prize in economics. Then there was Herb Simon, who came a bit later.
Oh, yeah.
But he was one of my classmates. And it was a very, very active and edifying intellectual environment that we had there. Well, I had planned...
And presumably the professors were good enough to really do this properly.
The difference between the university and the high school is enormous. And, I mean, all of the university professors knew what they were talking about. No question that they knew more than you did. But also, the students were so good. And that was very edifying, although sometimes a sobering experience when you come to college and you're at the top of your class, and then you find that there are others who are at the top of the class, and it's not so easy to be at the top of your class. Well, I was planning at that time to major in chemistry. So I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, possibly be a chemistry teacher, possibly in high school, possibly in college. Turned out that, and I never quite understood that totally, although I did very well in elementary chemistry, when I came to organic chemistry, I was told that I wasn't very handy in the laboratory.
Oh, yes.
Now, I've often thought about that, and I've often wondered to myself should I have accepted that or should I not have accepted that? Had I not accepted that, I think I probably could have become handy in the laboratory. But the professor, his name was Glatfeld, I remember, he was an organic chemist, he said, well, I think you probably ought to do something other than chemistry. So I thought a while, and I decided, well, maybe in physics I'd do better. Although I got very good grades, I got A's in all the courses, but somehow I didn't make much of an impression as a laboratory chemist.
But so, in laboratory organic chemistry, you have to have superb teachers who have an intuitive feel for techniques and impart. Otherwise, it's very difficult.
I guess so. Although the other people would get 80% yields in their preparation, I would get 10% yields or something like that. And was it because I was too impatient? I don't know. I know my father always he always had wanted to be an engineer, but he never did make being an engineer, but he always took delight in doing things with his hands and making things work and so on. So as I say, I think had I pursued it, I probably could have managed it, but I'll never know. So I switched to physics, and I found physics hard, not easy, but I did very well in it, in large part, I suppose, because I worked hard, and at the same time, I took lots of mathematics, and I really had a double major in mathematics and in physics. And I graduated. I guess I was at the top of the graduating class, or well, at that time they had these comprehensive examinations, and you had to take, what was it, 6 comprehensive examinations in the general courses, and then 2 comprehensive examinations, or 1 very major comprehensive examination in your major, which was physics. And I got A as the top grade in all of the courses, examination, except physics. And then in physics, I got C. And so I was very depressed. I thought, gee, there's something wrong. And then there was one of my fellow students said, well, he got, I don't know, D or something. So he complained to the management. And so they decided they would look at the exams again, and it turned out they had made an error in grading the examination. So the upshot was that I got A in it. So I got straight A's in everything. And by this time I did have, I was given a scholarship because I was very poor. And also I became an NYA student. And remember the National Youth Administration had these jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And
that was certainly a great help to students.
Oh, yeah. The job that I had was to analyze the literature, the German literature, in a classics library. What that meant was that I'd go through these old volumes of textual criticism of ancient Greek texts. It was all written in German, German journals, and I would make an abstract of each one of these, and that would go in the card file. It's called analyzing the literature, analyzing the journals. And so I say in a curious sort of way, I learned a little something about Greek and Roman literature this way. I hated the job, and yet I guess I learned something job, but it, I suppose, characterized much of what I did, that I always sort of would get involved in things other than precisely what I was supposed to be doing. Well, so I graduated. I guess I graduated with honors. I think that's what they called it. And I, by that time, had decided that I'd go into physics. And by that time, I'd also become friendly with Professor Carl Eckert, who later became one of the foremost oceanographers, theoretical oceanographers, and the head of the Scripps Institute. He, of course, had a very large influence on my future career. And I worked with him on a problem in theoretical physics on, well, it was a quantum mechanical Hamiltonian of the carbon dioxide molecule, which again is sort of funny. It proves again that anything you do in the past, later on it will be helpful to you, no matter what it is. And it's sort of funny that this was in 1935, 1936, and here it is almost 50 years later, and I've been pretty much involved in the whole question of the greenhouse effect, which is caused by carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide greenhouse effect is caused by the absorption of the carbon dioxide molecule in these three different bands, which correspond to the three different fundamental vibrations of the carbon dioxide. And then I go back 50 years and remember that was what I had worked on 50 years ago. So it all sort of fits together in a strange and curious sort of way.
Yes, well, let's see. So you were really exposed to quantum mechanics at that time, where it was just
yes,
really getting into the universities.
1935, yes, 1935.
Yeah, of course, it had a great development in the 20s, but I guess it didn't quite get into the university teaching until 1930s.
I guess the book that we used was one of the very first books. There were two books that we used, one by Halpern and Thiering, and the other by Linus Pauling.
Oh, yes.
Well, Pauling and Wilson, E. Bright Wilson, collaborating with Pauling. And that's where I really learned quantum mechanics, and Carl Eckert was my teacher, and he was my professor. Well, then my career took a rather curious turn because I got interested, and in fact I was enchanted, I suppose, by this strange Russian who was a Rockefeller Fellow at the University of Chicago, and then became a professor. His name was Nicholas Reshevsky. And Reshevsky was the one who was proposing to create a theoretical structure, a mathematical theoretical structure for biology. Excuse me. These ideas for creating a mathematical theoretical structure in biology. And I was simply enchanted by all this. And so I, along with several of my young friends, theoretically inclined friends in the physics department of the University of Chicago, decided that we would throw our lot in with him. And so I became a mathematical biophysicist. I helped Reshevsky start the field of mathematical biophysics, along with other people, of course. And that meant that along with my physics degree, I had to take a degree in biology. So I went back and took courses in experimental physiology and botany, and I must have taken, I don't know, perhaps 4 or 5 courses, various aspects of physiology. Actually did experiments on dogs, and I rather enjoyed it. And I spent the years from, I guess it was 1936 until about 41 or 42 as a mathematical biophysicist. Some of the things that I did then, looking back on it now, were pretty naive, but some of the things I guess I am still not ashamed of.
Yes, well, of course, if you can apply mathematics to a very complex biological system, it really strains your resources and your intellect.
Yeah, and of course, at that time, the whole enterprise was not regarded as being terribly, terribly serious, because most people didn't think that they thought it was a contradiction in terms to have mathematical biology. But Reshevsky was a man of infinite optimism, infinite imagination. He was very industrious, and he kept the pot bubbling, and he started his own journal. It was sort of a house organ called the Bulletin of Mathematical Biophysics, and our little group would publish in the Bulletin of Mathematical Biophysics. I was involved in 2 aspects of the work. One was the problem of periodicities in biological systems, and the other was the problem of nerve conduction, nerve excitation, nerve conduction. As I look back on what I myself was able to do, I was rather naive, I guess, though some of the ideas that were in these early papers on nerve conduction have to some degree survived and even are referred to now occasionally, though the theory has been superseded by the remarkable work that was done by Hodgkin and Huxley, for which they got the Nobel Prize in 1952. But as far as the other work was concerned, my doctoral thesis was based on an analysis of certain periodicities in biological systems. I didn't realize until very much later that we were nibbling at the considerations that underlay the work of Prigogine. Prigogine, who was the founder, really, one of the founders of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And it was he who formulated problems of the same character as the ones but he carried them very much farther. And I was amazed. I had not followed Prigogine's work. I was only dimly aware of it. I was amazed about 10 years ago when I was at a meeting in Romania, of all places, the European Physical Society, to hear one of Prigogine's disciples give a talk. And he started with a set of equations which were for all the world identical to the equations that I had considered 35 years earlier when I was working with Reshevsky. So in this sense, what I had done there then, which, well, I didn't think all that much of it, actually was in the same direction as this work that Prigogine finally brought to fruition. Of course, Prigogine won the Nobel Prize half a dozen years ago for this work that he had done. So I was involved then as a biophysicist working on problems that had to do with the diffusion of materials in and out of cells.
Oh yeah, so this must have laid the foundation for your work in reactor theory.
That's exactly correct. Because then what happened was, 1939 came along, and yes, I heard about fission. Again, we were a bit disappointed because one of my colleagues, Gail Young, who later came to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, had been talking about the fissioning, along with Reshevsky, the fissioning of cells.
Oh, yeah.
And mathematically, the problem was identical with the problem of the fission of the uranium nucleus.
Oh, yes.
But at that time, those two communities were intellectually completely separate. And so there's no one who knew about the fissioning of cells and also knew about the considerations of the Bohr liquid drop model. Had they done so, it's conceivable that Gail Young may have anticipated the discovery of the fission of uranium, but that's after the fact. It looks easier than before the fact, of course. But the work that I did with Reshevsky was done also in collaboration with Carl Eckert, and he followed my work very closely. And so shortly before the war broke out, I think this was in late 1941, shortly before the work that the U.S. was involved, at which time I was a research associate working for Reshevsky. I was asked by Carl Eckert if I would join him for 6 months half-time to work on this very far-fetched possibility of making nuclear energy. Now, I should explain that by 1940, I had decided that mathematical biology could go only so far, and that to make further progress, one would have to do experimental work. And so I had made arrangements to work with Kenneth S. Cole, K.C. Cole, who was, in my view, the foremost biophysicist in neurophysiology. And I received an NRC fellowship to work with Cole. But then the war came along, just as I was about to take the fellowship. And my life would have been totally different had I taken that fellowship. I would have been a neurophysiologist and have fun with nerves.
Oh, yes.
But instead, I came to work with Carl Eckert, and he said, well, the diffusion of neutrons and the diffusion of materials in and out of cells, not too different problem, and so why don't you just help work on the diffusion of neutrons. So I began work part-time, but by the time of Pearl Harbor, I shortly after Pearl Harbor, I worked full-time. I think I joined the work full-time, although I had been working part-time. I think it was January of 1942. Been working about 3 or 4 months with Carl Eckert before that on problems involved with neutron diffusion. And then Carl Eckert announced that he was going to leave to work on underwater sound at the laboratory in La Jolla in San Diego. That was a great disappointment to me because I wondered how could anybody be as bright as Carl Eckert, as competent as Carl Eckert. Eckert said, don't worry, Eugene Wigner is going to come. And of course, I had heard about Eugene Wigner as this great, wonderful physicist. And then I will never forget the first time I met this famous man. At that time, the work on the chain reaction was being established at Chicago under Compton's aegis, and Wigner was in Princeton, and he would commute between Chicago and Princeton. And during his stay, his short 5 or 6 day stays, he would have a succession of young people who were working on the problems, and he would meet them at all hours of day or night. And I remember the very first time I met him, I was in the mathematics building. It was called Eckhart Hall in Chicago. And I, with great fear and trepidation, showed him what I was doing. I was working on the problem of the multiplication in beryllium due to neutrons. And I guess I never have got over my awe of Eugene Wigner in the 45 years that have elapsed since that time, because I had never really met anyone with that extraordinary mathematical and physical power that he displayed. I'd never met anyone like that. I'd always thought that Carl Eckert was the brightest physicist I'd ever met, and here I saw somebody who was even brighter, and it was unbelievable to me, and had a tremendous effect on my ego. How could one possibly do anything that this guy would consider was at all worthwhile? So that's how I first met Eugene Wigner. And of course, he's had more influence on me than any other single scientist. He's had enormous influence because I gradually became his assistant in 2 respects. On the one hand, his assistant in charge of the nuclear design of the chain reactors, but also, I guess he got to like me as a person somehow, and would somehow depend on me to help him keep all of the prima donnas who were working with him happy. Well, they were young prima donnas, but they were young nevertheless, and so I would often intercede to sort of smooth things out, and he would depend on me for this, and he'd ask me for advice on things of that sort.
So essentially, you had to plunge right into the analysis and design of nuclear reactors.
Even though I didn't know anything about nuclear physics. Mm-hmm. So it was really a quick learn on my part. All I knew was something about classical diffusion theory, and I was great on Bessel's functions, which turned out to be kind of useful. But he put me in charge then. Well, after showing me how you make the calculations for the multiplication constant, he put me in charge of the multiplication constant. You must realize that in those days, before the first chain reaction had been established, it was a real question whether the multiplication constant with ordinary uranium and graphite could be made chain reacting at all. And I was the one who had to keep track of all the experiments that Fermi was doing and analyze them and then convert them into recipes and estimates of what the Hanford reactor itself would look like. So that really was my main job at the University of Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory. I remember one thing that I did, which I suppose persuaded Wigner that I was able to do something. I'm not sure that he was quite sure how much I could do at that time. He gave me the problem of computing the flow of neutrons through empty channels. I see if you have control rods in a big reactor, then when the rods aren't in, they're empty channels, and neutrons would stream through these channels. And there's a bit of a calculation to estimate how much that streaming would be. I was able to make that calculation, and I think he was visibly relieved that one of his younger people was able to make a calculation. Ordinarily, he'd do all the calculations himself.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember after he saw the result that I got, he looked at it and said, "Oh, yes, of course, that must be the result." And I was very relieved that I got somehow the correct result. And then I remember shortly thereafter, I went to see Fermi, and he said, "Oh, yes, I computed that independently," and he showed me how to compute it in about one line. It took me about 4 pages to make the computation.
Well, in other words, you had to more or less be in daily contact with the experimental results of
that's right.
Multiplication
yes, you see
experiments.
These were the so-called exponential experiments, and these were done successively, approximating more and more the actual Hanford reactor. And at each stage, I was supposed to analyze those results and see what they implied as far as the actual production reactor was concerned. In the course of this work, I was asked to do the nuclear design for the pilot plant that was going to be built in Oak Ridge, and that, of course, was the X-10 reactor. But that was something that was done sort of on the side, and was not a big deal by that time. I think he understood matters sufficiently. So the chain reaction then was completed on December 2nd, 1942. Just about 3 weeks later, the design that Wigner and his group had carried through for the original plutonium-producing reactor was completed. As the famous CE407 was the number of the report, and was engineering design of water-cooled, 250 megawatt water-cooled graphite moderated reactor. And that was the basic design for the Hanford reactor, the design which was taken over by DuPont and built into the plutonium-producing reactors at Hanford.
Was there some controversy with regard to the coolant at that time that you had to resolve?
When I first joined the project, there was a big controversy because the engineers wanted to cool the reactor with helium, and Fermi was inclined towards helium. Wigner said you'd never get helium to work in this short time schedule because the temperatures were too high, and therefore the materials problems would be intractable in such a short time. He was right. And so, single-handedly, he was able to turn the entire project around. I've often wondered, why was it that he was able to do it? And I've often said that the reason he was able to do it was because he was the only person, or almost the only person in the whole project, who combined great skill as a nuclear physicist with great skill as an engineer. Wigner, of course, was a chemical engineer by training. He was the only one who commanded both of those attributes. And so he was able to see both the engineering and physics aspects, and was able to make the compromises in multiplication that were necessary in order to go for water cooling.
Yes. Well, in retrospect, if they'd gone the helium route, it might have been delayed.
It would have taken much longer. It's doubtful that the plutonium project would have been built on time. So it was a great decision that Wigner made. And the DuPont people saw it, and they came in at first in favor of heavy water reactors, and then gas-cooled, but then they came around to the water-cooled graphite reactors. Well, so in the meantime, and alongside the work that was aimed simply at the Hanford reactors, I conducted research, along with Wigner, of course, on the other possible ways of making chain reactions. And we studied all sorts of ways. And one of the ways that we studied, and I did this in collaboration with Robert Christie, who later was one of the inventors of the implosion bomb at Los Alamos, but he was at Chicago at the time. And we did calculations on the use of water as a moderator and as a coolant. And I guess that's how I first got interested in the possibility of using water both as a moderator and as a coolant. Well, then after the Hanford reactors were built, well, we had this period during which they were being built, and of course we had all sorts of problems that would arise. One, for example, well, I remember a meeting in Compton's office with Fermi and Wigner around Christmas of 1943, and by that time we had word that the Germans were working on this. And so Wigner went up to the blackboard and showed that Germans might have the bomb by Christmas of 1944. Wrote it down, how long it would take to do this, that, and that. Of course, he was implicitly making the assumption that everybody on the German project was as smart as Eugene Wigner, and that, of course, was not correct.
Yeah. Well, they had Heisenberg, who was very smart, but not quite.
But he wasn't an engineer. He didn't have much aptitude or interest in this kind of heavy engineering that Eugene took great delight in, actually. And he didn't quite think of it as being possible for this war, whereas Szilard and Wigner, more than any others on the project, really thought it was possible. And of course, Ernest Lawrence thought that it was possible. Well, so one of the difficulties that we encountered was when they discovered that plutonium-240 had a huge spontaneous fission yield, and that therefore the plutonium that was made at Hanford might not work.
That must have been a devastating
yes, it was
finding.
terrible. Yes, because that occurred very late. I think it was early in 1944. And so people were thinking, is it possible to take the plutonium out of the Hanford reactors and convert it into U-233? And it was at this time that the idea of small, compact water reactors was thought of. It was Wigner that suggested it. And these reactors were in configuration not very different from reactors that have since been built with water moderation. Well, I continued to help out in the improvements in the design, where we worked on the disposition of the control rods at Hanford. And the Hanford project then finally was on its way, and so we were able to start thinking about longer range aspects of nuclear power. And we did this at the so-called New Piles Committee, which met about 10 times in late 44, early 45. And at these meetings, people would offer ideas for new kinds of reactors. About this time also, I had been contacted by the Navy, and they began showing some interest in submarine reactors, and this was, I believe, the first time that I suggested them the way to do the nuclear Navy was a pressurized water reactor. This was still during the war.
That was before the war ended.
Yes, before the war ended, yes. And
45.
I think it was Admiral Mills who was involved in that. Well, about this time, short before the war ended, plans were being made for what to do after the war, and Wigner got the idea of moving the group to Oak Ridge and building a great laboratory, a nuclear energy laboratory in Oak Ridge. And in the light of this idea, I moved down to Oak Ridge. Now, Oak Ridge at this time was doing experiments on light water reactor lattices, largely at my suggestion, because I'd been interested in light water, and we were quite amazed that light water with ordinary uranium almost was chain reacting. And had it been chain reacting, of course, our faces would have been very red, because why do we have to go to all the trouble of getting graphite if you could do it with light water?
Yeah.
You couldn't quite do it with light water.
It was 0.98 or something like
right.
that. Not quite 100.
Yes, not quite. So I used to commute down to Oak Ridge, and I was down at Oak Ridge since the graphite reactor was the one that I'd done the nuclear design for, so I was quite close to it. And that's how I came to Oak Ridge in May of 1945, shortly before the war ended. And then, of course, started my whole episode, my whole experience in Oak Ridge.
Incidentally, to just back up one bit as far as history is concerned, I had heard about that possibility of having to go the U-233 route. I don't think it's very adequately covered in the histories.
No, it isn't. It was an episode that lasted for about a month or so.
Yes, and
but that was where Wigner came up with this idea of a plate-type water-moderated reactor, which is a thorium converter.
Yeah. So I'm glad to get that, because I've been unable to find that.
Yes.
I've talked to some people.
Do they remember it?
Yes, but I think only one or two, and others denied that they'd ever heard of it.
Oh yes. No, that happened.
So I'm very glad to get that little point in history clarified.
Yes. Well, at Oak Ridge, Harry Brown in the chemistry division there was interested in a small homogeneous reactor. Wigner had always thought that homogeneous reactors were the way to go for breeder reactors. And when I came down to Oak Ridge, I said, well, that's really what you should be going after. I was working in the physics division at the time. And then when Wigner came down as the research director, and this was in 1946, laboratory still was, at that time, was run by Monsanto, we realized that you couldn't really do the homogeneous reactor without a great deal of experimental work, and that instead what you had to do was build a high flux reactor to do the experiments, the chemical experiments that were necessary to perform in order to get the information for real homogeneous reactors. So design began on a 10,000 kilowatt heavy water moderated light water cooled reactor using enriched uranium. Wigner came down as a research director about that time, and he pointed out that you had enough water in the coolant to moderate the neutrons, so you really didn't need the heavy water. So why don't you just push the heavy water out and push the fuel elements together? In which case you would have the advantage not only of very high slow neutron flux, but very high fast flux also. And that's how the MTR was conceived. It was an old heavy water reactor with the heavy water pushed out, and then few elements pushed together.
Oh yes, and you had then you had enough enriched uranium to be able to do.
And we did have enough enriched uranium to do it. Well, the development of the MTR occurred simultaneously with Rickover's coming to Oak Ridge. And I became really quite friendly with Rickover. He spent better than a year, and that's where he learned about nuclear power.
See, was that about 1947?
It was 1947, yes. And it was I who urged on Rickover that the way to make a nuclear-powered submarine was with a pressurized water reactor. Because the year earlier, well, I'd been thinking about it for several years by this time, and in 1946, one of my colleagues, mathematician Forrest Murray, and I had written a paper called, or a memorandum called Pressurized Water as a Coolant and Moderator. And in it we gave the possibilities for what later became the pressurized water reactor. It was a short memorandum, about 3 or 4 pages long, and I made a few calculations of what the thermal hydraulics would be, and it looked like a reasonable thing to do. And so when Rickover came on the scene, we told him that's the way to make your submarine. First, he was very reluctant to believe it, but then he had one of his young lieutenants, very bright lieutenants, naval lieutenants, look at the matter, and sure enough, well, there was Eli Roth and Lou Rodis, who later became very well known in the business. And they decided that there was something to it, and so gradually Rickover got the message. Now, present at the laboratory at the time was Harold Etherington, who had come down to head what was called the Daniels plant. That was a gas-cooled reactor. And Harold Etherington saw the point. Sam Untermeyer was there, and this was at the time when zirconium was shown to be corrosion resistant by Sam Untermeyer, and also the hafnium was the reason why the zirconium caused the neutrons to be absorbed in zirconium. People figured out how to get the hafnium out. And so everybody suddenly realized that this was indeed the way to make a submarine reactor, and that's really how the submarine reactor got started. I've always been unhappy that one of the key actors in this whole pressurized water reactor for submarines has never really been given adequate credit, and that was Harold Etherington.
Oh yes.
I don't know if you ever met
him.
Oh
yes, I distinctly remember him.
Chief engineer for Alice Chalmers.
Yes.
He came down along with many of the other people to this Oak Ridge School of Reactor Technology.
As I remember him, he was such a competent engineer.
Oh, tremendous, yes.
He had a grasp of all of the facets of the whole.
Yes,
the whole
and extremely
thing.
able. And he was the one who made the original decisions on how the thing should be laid out. The idea of having the pressurizer. The canned rotor pump actually was invented by Sam Untermeyer.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Sam at the time was Eugene Wigner's assistant for engineering at the laboratory. So the MTR was done about the same time as the submarine reactor. The MTR was originally an Oak Ridge project, but in 1948, the word came from on high that Oak Ridge would be out of the reactor business. So there was a big fuss that went on for a long time there, and although that was the decision on high, it was obviously not a very consistent decision, because they had GE in the reactor business and Argonne in the reactor business, and so it never was quite implemented that way.
Fortunately.
Well, I don't know, Clarence. I look back on it, and I suppose if I had to do my life all over again, Clarence, I would have spent far more of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory's resources on really solving the waste disposal problem. Because if you look at where we are now and you ask, what is the big problem? Well, one of them is reactor safety, but the other is the waste disposal problem. And you know as well as I do that we could have stashed those nuclear wastes permanently 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
And in retrospect, if it had been done early and it had been implemented early, there never would have been the kind. It wouldn't have.
It's insoluble. They say, well, look, of all the hazardous waste that we're producing in our society, the one that we really are doing right is nuclear waste.
Yeah, and if it had been implemented 10 years earlier, it would have been a whole different
the whole aspect of it. And if I have any regret, it is that.
Yeah.
Well, so about that time, Monsanto left, and the University of Colorado was supposed to come back in, but they had great trouble finding a director. I think they went through 15 or so names. Nobody wanted to be the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It was the most curious thing. And then Union Carbide came in. Still nobody wanted to be the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Finally, one day, Clark Center came to me. Well, actually, through Nelson Rucker.
Oh, yes.
And Nelson Rucker, when Carbide finally came in, he was designated as the director. And I said, well, we'll give you three choices. You can be the associate director, research director, or the director. Which you want? I said, I'll be the associate director. You can be the director. So that was Nelson Rucker was the director, and I became the associate director of the laboratory. And then that lasted for a while, and then we go off the record for a minute. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you knew that I'd said that to Clark.
Well, essentially, I gathered that.
Yeah. So, so we then had as a major effort of the laboratory the attempt to develop a breeder reactor, although the MTR was done as a joint project with Argonne and ORNL. But ORNL actually had the guts of it, the nuclear part, nuclear island, I guess you call it now, and Argonne had all the rest of it. And I guess the MTR must be regarded as having had a tremendous influence on the whole of reactor design. Because the general configuration, the idea that you lift the stuff up from the top, which seems like an obvious thing now, but that was shown to work on the MTR. And the MTR was the first really high-powered enriched reactor.
So it really was a prototype for the submarine reactor,
yes,
and then later, of course, our whole whole pressurized water industry.
Well, in a way, although there the connection was a little bit more tenuous because the pressurized water reactors used low enrichment uranium. Of course, Carl Cohn was the one who really pushed that, although all of us realized that you could do it that way with low enrichment. Well, then, of course, there was that period during which the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was heavily back in the reactor business, trying to make homogeneous reactors work. And then we were told by Larry Halfstead, who was the head of reactor development, that, if you want to work on homogeneous reactors, you also have to work on the aircraft reactor. And most of us did not really think that the aircraft reactor really could work. But we did feel that there was a very interesting technology there that someday could be applied to other aspects of reactor development and power development. And I guess we were very fortunate in having got R.C. Bryant, Ray Bryant.
Ray Bryant.
Who was a very brilliant chemical engineer to take over the aircraft project. And we pursued this possibility of making aircraft reactors with molten salts. It's interesting that molten salts, which some would have thought was an invention that came after the war, actually Eugene Wigner had thought of using molten salts during the war.
Oh, actually, that early?
Yeah, not seriously,
yes.
but he had thought of almost every combination that
Oh,
we now talk about. Well, the laboratory did operate 2 high-temperature molten salt reactors. These reactors, I suppose you'd have to say that it was a miracle that they operated at all, rather than that they operated well. The second reactor actually operated very well. That was the molten salt reactor experiment, which was a 7 megawatt reactor. Well, let me go back a moment. We did operate 2 homogeneous reactors, but as it turned out, the chemical stability of the system was not really sufficient. It was chemically unstable. So we finally gave up on the homogeneous reactor, although every now and then people keep coming back to the idea because it's such an attractive idea in principle, but in practice it turned out to be really quite difficult, although, well, we were young chemical engineers at the time, and God smiles on young chemical engineers. They do things that in later years would be regarded as crazy, but they get away with it. And of course, when you think of the containment that we used in that first homogeneous reactor, it makes your hair stand on end. We didn't have any real containment, slight negative pressure, and we had many millions of curies at a pressure of 1,000 pounds per square inch.
Yes, because that was one of the problems, is you needed the high pressure.
Yeah, the high pressure. And I suppose, what would we say, that high temperature is probably easier than high pressure. Neither is simple. Well, so then, as an outgrowth of the nuclear airplane, Ray Bryant always conceived of the nuclear airplane, which he never thought, he always thought it'd be a dodo, it wouldn't fly. There would be a spin-off, which would be a molten salt-based thermal breeder. And H.C. McPherson, who had been the director of research, I guess, at the National Carbide
Correct.
at the time, was leaving Carbide and he decided to come down to Oak Ridge. He had been there in 1948. And when he came to my office and we talked about things, I said, look, Mac, there's this hot idea about using molten salts or thermal breeders, and don't you think you might be just the person to pursue it, which he was, because graphite was so essential to it. He became very excited about it, and that was one of the best decisions I made, I think, despite the fact that the project was eventually terminated. But I still think that, well, eventually people will come back to this way of trying reactors.
Of course, it had great advantage in that it was lower pressure.
Low pressure and very high temperature.
And by dropping the temperature from the aircraft requirements, you alleviated some of the materials.
Right. Well, so where did we stand then? By this time it was, mid-1960s. The pressurized water reactor had long since become sort of a commercial device, and the laboratory had become a very large and powerful scientific institution, which was involved in all sorts of things. It had the most prestigious biology division under the directorship of Alexander Hollander, had a very powerful chemical technology group under Floyd Culler's direction. Perhaps one of the most important contributions to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was that for many years it was a source of isotopes for radioisotopes for scientific production. I didn't really have very much to do with the isotope production, and I suppose I'd have to say I didn't have that much to do with the work in chemical technology or in biology. I took, a sort of interest in all these things, and we had these information meetings each year, and I would attend the information meetings and try to act fairly intelligent, and we tried to make sure that people knew that the management was interested in what they were doing, because I've often felt that in a big research organization, one of the problems that people might have is a feeling of anonymity, that nobody really much cares whether they're there or aren't there. And so I tried hard to maintain that, and I'm pleased that my successors at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory have seen fit to continue these information meetings at the laboratory.
I think those information meetings have been probably also a source of dissemination throughout the whole country and the world, and certainly enhanced the reputation of the institution.
Right. Well, I guess I'd have to say that as I look at the major successes of the laboratory, it's difficult for me to say what the most important success was. Perhaps the two most important successes were production of radioisotopes. I suppose the other most important success was that the laboratory really set the established the standard designs for most of the research reactors throughout the world. And if you look at all of the research reactors in the world, 90% of them are really copies of things that we first did at Oak Ridge. Well, it seems like a small thing nowadays, but at that time, the very first time it was done, it wasn't a small thing. It was really quite a big thing. And many of us suffered plenty that first time that the MTR started, and then it stopped earlier than we thought, and we had to figure out why was it stopping and so on. So all these things which look easy later on are really quite hard at first. But then, of course, we had all these many spin-offs. The whole biology business was a marvelous spin-off. The materials developments, for example, the spin-off from the nuclear aircraft were these alloys, which been the basis for a huge industry now.
Yes,
the Cabot Company has become very rich as a result of commercializing an alloy that was developed in the AMP program.
Yes, well, that was the so-called INOR
8, yes,
INOR
which
8,
I think is now called, what is it, Haskell-IN?
But yes, and then also, of course, I believe the chemical reprocessing methods, which are still used today,
now standard chemical reprocessing
all developed at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
Most of the progress to date on waste disposal came from the laboratory. Though I have to say that I'm disappointed that we did not succeed in really convincing the public that waste disposal was a fully practical thing. The research reactor, the high flux isotope reactor, is still the most powerful research reactor in the world in many respects. It was built at Oak Ridge. The many accelerators, well, Oak Ridge was where heavy ion physics got started. It was Alexander Zucker. And you can point to many things like that. Though one would have to say that the laboratory, partly because its mandate was not specifically power reactors, was always a bit peripheral to, I guess, the mainstream of power reactor development, which was quickly taken over by industry. But the laboratory, of course, was very much involved in this problem of safety of reactors.
Yeah, well, there have been probably a continuation of hundreds of different problems.
Right.
The laboratory
Right.
was of value to, and
Yeah.
really establishing the technology of power reactors.
Right.
So,
Well, so that really summarizes pretty much my career as the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I guess I should say that at the same time that I had this career in the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, I sort of had other careers going on the side. Because I was asked to serve on the President's Science Advisory Committee for 3 years, from 1959 to 1962. And I guess during that one summer that I was working on this report on information, that's when I got to know your father pretty well, Jane, because he was working on information also in a different respect at the other end of the hall, and every now and then we get together and chat about it. He was very enthusiastic about his scheme, but, well, I guess I didn't take it quite as seriously as he did. I don't know how you felt about it at the time.
Which scheme was this?
well, information.
We had that
theory.
scheme for
Oh,
this.
for the library, the library of medicine. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I think you
Well,
were stepping into a
Yeah,
very difficult area.
that's right.
Too
That's
many
right.
people. had their own
And an
ideas.
area which still has not been solved.
Yeah, right. So, as part of that career, I got interested in this whole question of science policy and how do you establish priorities in science. So I wrote a number of papers which appeared in this little journal, Minerva, called Criteria for Scientific Choice. And that started sort of a growth industry in science policy. And I don't know if I asked myself, well, what really did you contribute in much of that stuff? Mostly I contributed as much as anything, I suppose, a language, which is not unimportant.
No, of course, that's very important. So people.
Well, the word technological fix, for example, is one of my.
Yes, that's right.
Or big science, that was a word that I cooked up. And I would cook up these words, and then they'd sort of fit, and people would use them. And that would start people on writing learned papers on what's meant by these things. And I'm amused that here 20 years later I've come back to that sort of philosophic kind of discussion. The other career that I got launched on was in scientific information, and I was the chairman of this committee that wrote this paper on scientific information, and it's called Science, Government, and Information. That's still a rather standard work. In information. Well, then I spent, after I left the laboratory, and as I look back on it, I left at really just the right time. I don't think I could have quite tolerated the present way in which the laboratory's relation to the Department of Energy has worked out. Because as I look back on it, well, I had a certain amount of freedom, not as much as perhaps I would like, but generally I think the Atomic Energy Commission was very supportive of the laboratories. And for a while I don't think the Department of Energy has been quite that supportive, but I don't really know how to that close to it. So I spent a year in the Office of Energy Research and Development, which was in the White House, and then became part of the Federal Energy Administration. And we were thinking deep thoughts about energy during that time. We thought about such things as what do you do when nuclear energy falters, as it's faltering now. We helped set up the Solar Energy Research Institute. That was an idea that came out of that office. And I suppose the most important thing we did was we helped engineer the transition from the Atomic Energy Commission to the
ERDA and the Energy Research and Development Administration.
Right.
And so on.
And then at that time, I established the Institute for Energy Analysis, which was suggested to me really by Bill Baker, the former chairman of the board of Bell Labs.
Oh, yes.
And he was very enthusiastic about it, and so we got it going. And it has been going for 10 years now, and we have done, had a number of, I think, fairly good ideas about what to do about the energy problem fundamentally and broadly. I guess there have been two main thrusts. I guess we would describe our position at the Institute for Energy Analysis as being somewhat right of center as compared to the positions of most of the energy think tanks, which I regard as left of center. Now, the right-left axis here isn't the usual communist capitalist. It's rather centralized versus decentralized, nuclear versus non-nuclear, electrical versus non-electrical. And the left thinks that energy should be non-electrical, non-nuclear, non-central. The right thinks that it should be electrical, centralized, and nuclear.
Yeah.
And I think that though nuclear energy is in a bad state now, that the market is showing us a different answer, that we are continuing to move into electricity, we're continuing to find virtues in centralized electricity. And I think despite the travail that we're experiencing in nuclear, that nuclear is going to get out of this.
Yeah, well, it's a matter of time and overcoming public perceptions and a lot of very complicated economic factors involved, which are all, incidentally, there are solutions for these. They're rather agonizing.
We don't know everything even now. One of the points is that these nuclear plants can well last 100 years rather than 40 years. You build these big concrete devices, and they can well last for 100 years. And if it lasts for 100 years, then you've already paid for it. And the operating costs are very low, and so it would be cheap electricity that you have now. So that although at the moment electricity goes through a high, it eventually is going to go through a low again, and that has to be factored into all of this.
Yes, as soon as these are 20 years is up, the capital costs go down drastically.
Just like Norris Dam, we paid for it, and so we get the electricity for 5 mils per kilowatt hour from Norris Dam.
So things you can see that things can't change around, and that's what I was going to lead into. I remember you always used to make a lot of predictions, scientific and reactors and other things. In fact, you were very bold in making several $1 bets or $5 bets as to what would take place 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years. And so I was wondering if you could dip into your crystal ball and what are some of the directions you feel?
Well, let me say that I've generally tended to bet optimistically on the state of the world and pessimistically on the achievements of technology, because I think that the achievement of nuclear power and then the space achievements have spoiled people into believing that everything is simple. And in particular, I continue to be really quite pessimistic about the prospects for fusion. Now, I may be shown to be totally wrong about this, but it just seems to me to be a very difficult technology, far more difficult than reactors, really, and probably far more expensive. I guess I continue, therefore, to be quite pessimistic about solar energy. Not that I don't think we shouldn't be working on it. We should be working on it. I don't really see a clear resolution of the storage problem in solar. That's economical. But maybe it will turn out to be.
and the sheer problem of space required.
And the problem with space, and of course some of these far out ideas are crazy. I mean, the solar satellite, I think, is just really quite stupid. Because all you're solving there is a storage problem, because the sun's always shining out there, and there are half a dozen ways of solving the storage problem on Earth that are cheaper than that and still are too expensive to compete with nuclear power. Now, the problems that we're having with nuclear power now, they're very real, but I cannot believe that they're anything but transitory, because you look at other countries and they don't have these same problems. France doesn't have these same problems. And are we more stupid than France? The Russians don't seem to have these problems. The Swiss don't have these same problems.
So you would be optimistic, due to the fact that apparently we can solve, as far as technological fixes to the problem. It looks like it's very possible. In fact, these other countries have demonstrated it.
Right.
So it remains to be only a public perception, which will pass, of course.
Right. So I see, as far as the energy future is concerned, Clarence, that the future is going to be a very heavily electrical energy future. And in this I disagree in the deepest way with the energy revolutionaries like Barry Commoner and Amory Lovins, with whom I often argue. I think they're just wrong as the day is long. They mistake decentralization of the energy production with decentralization in end use. Electricity is exquisitely capable of decentralizing end use.
Oh, yes.
And that's more important than decentralizing the mode of production, which is awkward, expensive, time-consuming. No way.
And the economics just can't possibly
I don't see how it can
work.
I don't see how it can. Well, we've gone, I don't know, for a long time.
Well, this is just, I think that
what you wanted.
If you have, I think there's, I think you've given a good...
Are there other things you want me to talk about?
The summer, I think there's only one thing you've done, of course, a tremendous amount of thinking with regard to the directions the world should take so far as coming to grips with the nuclear threats to the world and proliferation.
If you wish, I'd be glad to talk a few minutes about
if you could talk a few minutes on that.
Let me just say two things. One, I think that the connection between nuclear power and proliferation is very much exaggerated. And I think there are additional things that can be done. For example, I think that a take-back scheme ought to be instituted, where you take the spent fuel back. And this is not much of a hardship, because it's turned out that because the price of the breeder has gone up and the amount of uranium has gone up also, the time when we will need the breeder has been pushed into the future. And therefore, the incentive for doing reprocessing is not as great as if we use things. So we have, 20, 30 years in which to do other things. And I think the most sensible thing to do is to have the United States say, either take title to all of its fuel and simply lease it so that it comes back, or otherwise require that all of the spent fuel come back to the United States. Use essentially the same scheme that the Soviet Union was using, where they insist on taking all the fuel back.
And that seems to be 100% successful.
100% successful, and it also solves for these other countries the problem of waste disposal.
So it's one of these things which is mutually satisfactory to both countries.
And then, of course, with respect to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is by far the most important problem that the world faces, should go back a moment and say that Eugene Wigner came back to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and I guess it was the early 60s, to institute a program on civil defense. And I became very influenced by his thinking, and have been racking my brain for 20 years or more on how do you deal with the arms race, the arms confrontation, and is there some configuration other than mutually assured destruction? About 18 years ago, I gave a speech which I called "Let Us Prepare for Peace," which I said that true disarmament, meaning total disarmament, does not come except from a posture of very strong defense, because you wouldn't trust a few clandestine weapons. But people were not ready to listen then. But here it is. In 1984, President Reagan has made his famous Star Wars speech on March 23rd, 1983. I think the whole issue is being reopened, and I think there are some possibilities now that have to be given very serious attention. The one that a young colleague of mine, Jack Parkhurst, and I have been proposing that we're very enthusiastic about, and perhaps it will be taken seriously in some quarters, is this thing which we call the Defense Protected Build Down. And this is an idea whereby you deploy defensive weapons initially within the ABM Treaty. The United States deploys defensive weapons which protect its first strike weapons, the MXs, say. But because they're now protected, they are less vulnerable to a strike from the Soviets, and therefore you don't need as many of them to have the same second strike capability. And therefore, at the same time you deploy your defense, you can, without reducing your second strike capability, reduce the number of offensive weapons. That is, you compensate for, you reduce your offensive first strike weapons by an amount that compensates for the amount of defense that you put up to prevent the first strike from the other guy from wiping you out.
Well, that's a practical step-by-step.
Right. And I've been trying to promote this. An article was recently published in Foreign Policy along these lines, creating a fair amount of discussion. At least it's a new idea. And this remarkable book with Freeman Dyson's Weapons and Hope suggests that ideas of this genre are ripe for serious consideration. So some of us are seriously considering devoting a good deal of our time and attention to exactly this question.
And it really is not totally inconsistent with the so-called Star Wars.
No, it's very much in that line. Although I think that Defense Secretary Weinberg, I don't think, was justified in promising a total defense with any degree of Star Wars. I don't think that's in the cards, but maybe it is.
Well, no, of course, there's a little bit of an analogy that bulletproof vests for policemen are not 100%, but they certainly are. They help save a large number of lives.
So I don't know, maybe that will change the terms of the discussion. I look forward to it. Pretty exciting, and I'm only going on 70 years old, Clarence, so I'm just ready to get going on this.
Well, fine. This is wonderful. I'm sure that there'll be a lot of discussion on this in the future.
Let's hear how
this has been
sounds.
This has been marvelous, and I think that this concludes the interview, and let's get a playback on some of it.